This episode of Sportish is sponsored by the Active Industry First Start Traineeship Program, funded by the Queensland Government.
Hello and welcome to Sportish, where we talk about life through the lens of sport. My name is Libby Trickett.
And I'm Georgie Trickett.
And welcome back to our Teen Athlete series.
Today's conversation is one that we are having in all our group chats. It's something, you have a coffee with a friend, you're on a sideline of sport. Inevitably, the topic of concussion comes up for discussion.
And I think this is something that has been hugely anxiety-inducing for me, honestly. As a mother of 5, 3 older girls and 2 younger boys, my girls really haven't been interested in contact sport to this point, but I'm conscious that perhaps that might change with my boys coming through. And that is something that I've been really wrestling with, whether I would allow them to actually participate.
And meanwhile, I've got kids all involved in either direct contact or
mild contact
sports, I would say. And many of you will be in the midst of your contact sports season, whether it's AFL, rugby league, rugby union, and other games, other games where you will be having physical contact like netball and basketball and all those sorts of sports. So to start a conversation around concussion, we wanted to ask into the studio the AIS Chief Medical Officer, Chair of the Australian Olympic Committee Medical Commission and Fellow of the Australasian College of Sport and Exercise Physicians, Dr David Hughes.
So he sounds pretty qualified.
Yeah.
David, welcome to Sportish.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Us as lay people, people who do not have a medical background, for me, I just think that is such an incredibly impressive list of qualifications that we have just heard. Could you quickly, I'm sure it took you years to get all those qualifications, but just very quickly, can you explain your area of expertise?
I'm a medical practitioner, so I do a basic medical degree like any other doctor in the country. And then once you've completed your medical degree, doctors have the option of specialising, going into different areas of specialty. You could become a cardiologist, become a neurologist. And there is a 4-year advanced training program to become a sport and exercise physician, and that's through the Australasian, which is Australia and New Zealand College of Sport and Exercise Physicians. So I completed that back in about 1995, which gives you an idea of my age. I then went into private practice in Canberra as a sport and exercise physician, worked in private practice for about 18 years, which I really enjoyed, and worked with some professional sporting teams during that time, including the Olympic team, the Opals, the women's basketball team, who were fantastic. And then from 2013, unexpectedly found myself here as Chief Medical Officer, so out of private practice and really focused on, I suppose, Olympic, Paralympic and Commonwealth Games type sports, which of course you're familiar with. And that's been my role for the last 13 years. So I've really enjoyed being here as the Chief Medical Officer. And I thought my one Olympics was 2012 going with the Opals, and then ended up here, and then went to Rio and Paris as Medical Director, and which was a fantastic experience. And now I still provide some advice for doctors who are going to Olympics or Youth Olympics or other major events. I'm stepping back from being operational at games myself. So that's sort of a very quick whip through of how I've ended up where I am now.
Incredible.
David, we're here today to talk about concussion. And I think one of the important places to start when it comes to concussion is that there's a variety of terms that we can use when we discuss head injuries. Can you sort of outline for us what the different terms are and how we should be using them when we do discuss this issue of sport?
Sometimes you'll hear people talk about repetitive head trauma, and it can be problematic in itself in that there's no clear definition of what a head trauma is when someone feels 100% normal, right, when they feel completely fine. So when someone goes out and plays a game of rugby or AFL, netball, basketball, it's quite likely that there'll be sort of head trauma, that's incidental head knocks during the game, but most of them will not cause any symptoms and the person will feel absolutely fine. Then there are what we call concussion, and concussion is where someone receives a blow that's not necessarily to the head, often to the head, but it can be to the body where there's just force transmitted to the head. And with a concussion, there is a transient disturbance of neurological function. So someone, is not themselves, and there's a whole range of varieties of how a concussion can present. And no two concussions are the same. And some people will have symptoms for a number of hours and then it clears. Some people will have symptoms that last weeks, and some people can even have more prolonged symptoms. But generally, with a concussion, generally speaking, someone makes a full recovery and gets back to their normal neurological function. In the majority of cases, the vast majority of cases, people with an appropriate stand-down period, appropriate rehabilitation, are able to get back to sport safely. But obviously there's a lot of controversy in the papers too about concern people have about long-term brain health from repeated head trauma. And there's, some people are saying even without concussion, just the repeated head trauma that seems innocuous, could that potentially be contributing to long-term brain health issues? And certainly with repeated concussions, if someone's had repeat concussions, that feeding into long-term brain health problems. And we know external to sport, if we think outside of sport for a moment, concussion is classified as what we call mild traumatic brain injury. So there's a trauma of some sort, but if you do an MRI or normal imaging of the brain, you generally won't see any structural defect. Moderate or severe traumatic brain injury is where actually there's, like, you might get in a motor vehicle accident or someone falling from height or physical assaults. You might see someone who's actually got, structural injury to their brain as a result of that trauma. So I don't know if I've clarified or just made things more confusing, but effectively, concussion is a type of mild traumatic brain injury where there doesn't appear on normal imaging to be any structural damage. It's arguable that perhaps something's happening at the microscopic level, but certainly there's a transient physiological disturbance, and it causes concern because parents don't like to see their child forgetting things or being emotionally labile or being stressed or having, bad headaches. Concussion is something that concerns people in sport and really more broadly across the community. And so the AIS has taken a lead role in trying to provide guidance to the sports system about the safe recognition, management and return to sport from concussion.
Can you take us through, we are people on the sideline watching a child's sports match. They seem to have had a head knock. They might have fallen on the ground and hit the ground with their head. Or as you even say, there are other kind of hits to the body that can cause similar situations and symptoms. What are the next steps for us as parents to kind of intervene or look at to make sure that we're taking the best care of our kids?
The main thing is to remove the child from the sporting setting, make sure that they are put somewhere, that they are somewhere safe. If there's any suspicion of something more than just a concussion, like they've had a blow, but they're also complaining of neck pain, or they've got any sort of neurological symptoms like, pins and needles in the limbs, then really they should just be kept still. And, someone should call an ambulance. That is in the far minority of cases. The far majority of cases will be pretty much how you described there, that there'll be a significant blow, a hard tackle or a blow to the head, and the person will just not be themselves. They'll either be unsteady on their feet, or they'll be teary and upset, or saying that they feel like they're in a fog, or saying that they've got a really bad headache. In that situation, they should be removed from the field to make sure there's no danger of them having any sort of further head trauma. Someone should stay with them. If there's someone nearby who's familiar with assessing people or has some medical skills, that would be great for them to be assessed. If there's any concern, then they should be taken to a healthcare practitioner at the earliest possible time just to be assessed.
And we know that I've had a couple of children have concussions, nausea, symptoms that present post the event. They're also reasons to go and see a GP or an emergency department, particularly in the hours that follow a concussion?
Yes, that's right. One of the things about a concussion is that concussion is an evolving injury. So it doesn't, what you see at 2 minutes is not necessarily the same as what you're going to see at 2 hours, which is not necessarily what you're going to see at 2 days. And there are cases where people have had significant blows, have been assessed, seem okay, and then they're followed up 2 days later and they clearly have, evidence of having had a concussion. So, and that's why we say, if in doubt, sit them out. So if there's been a significant blow, and you just mentioned, what if, their head hit the ground fairly forcibly? Well, in professional sport, that would be an indicator. Even if they looked 100% fine, if they'd had a heavy blow with their head hitting the ground, they would be taken off for a HIA or head injury assessment on the sideline. before then someone making it, and that would be a doctor, of course, in that situation, making a decision as to whether they can go back on the field. So I would say if you saw someone get a big blow to the head, either a collision with another body or hitting the ground on the head or hitting the head on any object, they should be removed from play. And, we say if in doubt, sit them out. It's, where we think there's something just not quite right with this child, we really just got to err on the side of caution. No child came to any great harm from having a few weeks off sport, but there are cases where people have come to significant harm by being allowed to stay on the field when they've got a concussion or being returned to the field and getting a second blow when they're already concussed. That can lead to really bad consequences. So when in doubt, sit them out.
I think that is such an important point, because I think a lot of people and a lot of parents might think that a head injury or a concussion is something very dramatic.
Yes.
Being knocked unconscious, we've all seen those tackles where someone gets up and they just basically fall back over again because they're so dizzy and disoriented. But you're saying if there's any concern at all.
Yeah, it can be very subtle. Like if someone's, really, gets a decent concussion and they're clearly not themselves, they're lying on the ground and they're really slow to get up and they're unsteady on their feet, that's pretty obvious something's wrong, and no one would have too many arguments about that. But sometimes there's a significant blow between bodies. And remember, the concussion is not caused by a direct blow to the brain. It's an acceleration, deceleration. So the head's moving fast and then comes to a sudden standstill, or the head is stationary and suddenly accelerated. And it's essentially the brain moving within the skull. That's what's causing the concussion, right? And that's why you can get a big blow to the body, nothing to the head, but because there's, this rapid acceleration of the head, that can cause the brain to shift inside the skull and cause the concussion symptoms. And it's not as simple as saying that looks dramatic, that's a high risk of concussion. Some people get concussions when you look back through the video and you think it's really hard to spot where that actually occurred. And so every individual is different. And really what we're looking for, though, is where there's been some significant contact with the body or the head and someone is just not quite themselves. They're sort of just a blank or vacant look. And sometimes it's a parent or a teacher or a coach who's worked with that child for a long period of time who could say, this just isn't them. Or they're emotionally labile. I've seen this with one of my own children who was concussed playing netball, just really emotionally labile for reasons no one could put their finger on and was completely not quite in her personality. So there's lots of things like this that can be quite subtle. And I think really where there's been anything that's an occurrence on the field that is somewhat concerning, even if the child looks pretty much themselves, when someone notices that there's something in their behaviour that's just not them, I would say assume concussion and remove them from the field. And there are some tools to help people who are not medically trained. There's a thing called the Concussion Recognition Tool 6, CRT6, which is available for free online. That can be downloaded as a PDF, and it's a really useful tool for things to look out for, not to diagnose concussion, because, you have to have some healthcare training to diagnose concussion, but so that people who are not medically trained can suspect a concussion or recognise a suspected concussion and have people removed from the field.
Hey, Libby.
Hey, Georgina.
Have you heard about the Active Industries First Start traineeship program?
Is that the one where you get $20,000 wage subsidy for not-for-profit clubs and organisations?
Totally. I thought this was just wild and I didn't know that this existed, and I can already think of so many clubs that could benefit from this. This is a bit of money that you can use to bring someone on who's not just a volunteer. They're actually an employee of your club to help you get all the things done that you need to get done.
And are they the people who kind of haven't been in work for a while, so it helps them return to work as well?
It can be, or it can just be you converting a volunteer into somebody who can do all the doing.
Because that's the thing, in all of these sorts of organisations, it relies so much on volunteers and people are so busy. And they need to be able to put together these things that help organisations take it to another level.
We want people in clubs to be able to rely on somebody to print out the spreadsheets, to organise the websites so that the people who are volunteering can get out on the court or on the field and do what they do best.
Basically, people can take advantage and all they need to do is submit an application, and AQIA can actually help you with that. So head to the website or click the link in the show notes. Take advantage of this incredible opportunity.
David, I want to talk about the stand down period or the sit out period that the guidelines talk about. And it's very clear that it's 14 days post symptoms that your child can then return to sport, and a little bit longer before they return to contact sport. But I know, because I get told and I get phone calls, that there are parents out there who specifically ask managers not to record a head incident or a head injury because they want their child to be able to play rep trials or play rep sport the next weekend.
Yeah.
Just how important is it for parents and families to be working within these timeframes and maintaining these 14 days, these 21 days periods post symptoms ending?
It's really important. We're dealing with a situation where the AIS is providing information, to the community. We want to provide balanced information. We want it to be really clear. We want it to be really consistent, and we want to make sure that we're really sure of our facts. And one of the problems is that we're dealing at the extremes with two different groups of people. One is we're dealing with people who are hyper anxious about any sort of strong contact in sport. So, I have parents approach me whose child has had one minor concussion, and they're concerned that their child's going to have long-term brain damage, and they're convinced that their child's going to...
Just for full clarity.
Okay. Full transparency. And, there's no evidence for that. Okay, there's no evidence for that. There is so much very high-level evidence showing that particularly being involved in team sports delivers huge social, emotional, psychological, physical benefits for children, particularly going through those difficult teenage years and early adulthood, when being part of a social group and having a tribe is so important. Team sports provide huge benefits to those young people, but so we don't want people being scared away from being involved in team sports where there's contact or collision. But it is also true that every concussion must be treated seriously. There's no such thing as a good concussion. And we treat, even though the vast majority of people who get concussed will make a full recovery and won't have long-term brain health issues, we should treat every concussion that occurs as if it's got the potential to cause long-term problems. And that's why the AIS takes a very conservative approach to how we manage concussion and returning people to sport. When the AIS was producing these guidelines for youth and community sport in Australia, the Australian guidelines, what we said was, one, we wanted to ensure that every Australian, regardless of their geographical location, socioeconomic status, or level of sport, has access to the most up-to-date, relevant, easily digestible information. And that's why we've made all this information available for free on the AIS website. The other thing we wanted was consistency of message, so consistency between sports and consistency between jurisdictions and strength of position. And so the AIS teamed up with the Australian College of Sport and Exercise Physicians, Sports Medicine Australia, the Australian Physiotherapy Association. We aligned with the governments of New Zealand and the United Kingdom, so it's the first ever international intergovernmental agreement on guidelines for managing concussion. We want to keep it simple, so two numbers, 14 and 21. So 14, the individual must be symptom-free, so being able to do exercise, be symptom-free for 14 days before they can go back to any contact training where there's potential for a head blow. And that's based on the fact that we know that when someone first feels good and first says, "Oh no, I feel back to myself," they've actually still got a brain injury. It might be mild, but we want a 14-day buffer where they're running around, exercising, doing their normal exercise, except avoiding anything that's at risk of contact or collision. So they're exercising at a high level because exercise is a strong provoker of concussion symptoms. And if someone's been exercising and symptom-free for 14 days, we feel that's a pretty good sign that they're okay to go back and stick their toe in the water of contact training, but not back to full competition. The 21 is an absolute minimum, and it's a minimum, not that everybody can go back to 21 days. 21 days is a minimum that you can go back to full competition, like playing matches on the weekend where there's full contact. But you can only do that at 21 days if in that 21 days you've been able to complete 14 days symptom-free, and then you do some contact training, make sure you're okay, and then you can go back. So only the very mild concussions where the symptoms clear in the first few days will actually get back in 21 days.
Yeah.
Because let's take an example. If someone had a more severe concussion and had symptoms for 4 weeks, they feel symptom-free at 4 weeks. Well, they can't go back to contact it 4 weeks and 1 day. We say, no, okay, you've had symptoms for 4 weeks. Now we want you to be, exercising at a high level, but we want to observe that you remain symptom-free for 14 days. When you've been symptom-free for 14 days, you can go back to contact training and see how you go. But so that for that person who's had symptoms for 4 weeks, they won't start contact training for 6 weeks. That way, we're always providing a buffer where they've got 14 days that they've been exercising and they've been completely symptom-free, even though they've been sprinting, running, jumping, doing all those sorts of things. And then they can go back to contact training. So the 21 days is an absolute minimum. I encourage your viewers to go to our website. If they just look for AIS concussion, that will take them straight to the website. And there's a whole heap of resources, videos, downloadable documents. And one of the downloadable documents is a clearance form for return to sport from concussion. And this is where someone in the club might, or a parent might tick, this form is to go to the healthcare practitioner with the person who's concussed. And it says, this person's coming to see you because they might be concussed. These are the symptoms they reported. This is what happened. So any lay person can fill that section in. The healthcare practitioner will then see the person who's potentially been concussed, assess them, put them through a program, and they cannot go back to sport until they sign off the bottom. And this bottom just doesn't say this person's fit to play. It says, I'm certifying that this person has been symptom-free for 14 days, has gone through a graduated return to sport. It's not less than 21 days since the concussion incident, and, that I'm satisfied that they're good to go. So it's really ticks all the boxes to make sure we've got a standard of when people can go back to sport following a concussion. And I know some GPs have said to me that one form has revolutionised how they treat concussion in their practice, because, to sign off that someone's cleared, you actually have to go through these steps that, yes, they've been symptom-free for 14 days, etc. And we feel that by doing that, we're really making sport safer. As I said, we've got agreement from the New Zealand government and the UK government that this is how they want to go as well. And that's that strength of position, one of those aims that we have, having strength of position. We think we've got strength of position because of the governments and the other organisations. We've had over 30 sport organisations in Australia align with our guidance. Because I think one of the things that's a nightmare for teachers is having different concussion guidelines for different sports. And so we're saying below the elite level for youth and community sport, this should be standard across all sports. And I have to say that we're really pleased with the amount of traction it's getting across different sports.
Yeah, I think that is the most important and powerful way to kind of shift behaviour, is to have that consistency of message, not just in Australia, but globally would be incredible. I grew up in the 90s watching, the NRL with men, hitting each other incredibly hard and almost taking pride on getting significant head injuries and getting back up and out onto the field in the second half. And, I think that is still, to a slightly lesser extent, still happening. I can think of a Brisbane Broncos player, Reece Walsh, who recently had a facial fracture, which I would argue is a significant head knock. And obviously we don't know the information. We don't know any of that symptomology. And obviously I hope and I assume that he is being well looked after within the Brisbane Broncos fold. But he has recently returned to full contact competition with a specific type of helmet that he is wearing. But he has communicated in the media that he hasn't felt quite ready necessarily to return, but is returning. And I worry significantly about the young men and women who are watching these athletes get a facial fracture and then a few weeks later return to competition. How important is it at the elite level that we start to change these behaviours and expectations around how we navigate these head injuries, especially with all of the news and media that there has been around significant brain injuries?
I think it's a really good point. And what we're talking about there is culture, the culture around concussion. And cultural change is difficult, but I actually think we are getting there. It's really important, the role modelling around concussion by people who are playing at the elite level. And I think we are seeing more and more former players who are coming forward and saying, what we used to do was not good, and I would agree with that. It wasn't good. There are some statistics around in some of the professional codes to say that, when they look back at their statistics from the early 2000s, the majority of players, so over 50% of players who were subsequently diagnosed with concussion, actually either continued to play or went back on the field when they were concussed, and that's playing at the elite level. Now, in some of those same sports, the average time for someone to come back to play after a concussion, even at the highest level, is, closer to 3 weeks. So that's a huge change from people being put back on the same day or being left on the same day to now the average is about 3 weeks, and some stay out for longer than that. I think it's really important. You mentioned before about the issue with parents, some parents being pushy, and I was sort of saying we're dealing on one side with parents who are concerned that, their child, after, one concussion, is going to have, long-term brain health, for which there's no evidence on that. But then we have other people, and I've certainly experienced it myself, particularly when I was in private practice. Parents bring their children in who were clearly had suffered a concussion, and they just wanted me to clear them because, this is their chance to play for the first 15 at school or something like that. And it was always sort of like, gobsmacking to me that this parent was actually seeking to really, push the child, sitting there saying nothing, but the parent is the one applying the pressure to get the child back. As a parent, that astounds me. I do think that the role models at the elite level have a big role to play. And look, we'll get instances every now and then. You see it in the professional codes, there'll be a blow up because they'll say, this person looked like, when I go back and look at the slow-mo on the video, it looked like they were clearly concussed, they were unsteady on their feet, and yet they weren't taken off straight away. And that's the sort of, I suppose, vigilance analysis that's going on, frame by frame on videos these days. Often you'll see people who look completely normal, but there's been a big hit, but they get up and they're running around, they're doing everything. They still get dragged off for a head injury assessment because there are now, in many of the codes, there's a doctor there whose only job is to look for head injuries. And while the game's carrying on, they go back and look at video and try and pick up big head knocks that were missed, or see if anything was missed where someone should be taken off for a head injury assessment. There are huge fines that have been handed out to individual clubs who haven't followed concussion protocols in various codes. So while I think there's a lot more attention on concussion, and that's good, there's a lot more, video analysis of what happened in a concussive incident, and there's a lot more scrutiny of doctors and coaches and other people who might have a say in when someone goes back to play. I do think, I would say overall now, it's a much safer environment in the contact and collision codes than it was in the early 2000s, when I think a lot of people were allowed to play when they probably shouldn't have been allowed to play, and we wouldn't let them play these days. So I do think it's safer. There's no room for complacency. We worry about people who have multiple concussions or seem to start to, get a predisposition to having concussions. And so there's lots of challenges still there for us. But I do like to think that it's a safer environment, both at the elite level and at the community level. Go to the AIS website because there's a whole bunch of resources there to teach you more about concussion and how to deal with things safely.
I'm just going to put this to you to take us out today. I have a dear friend of mine who's a neurosurgeon. He has a son who plays footy, and he has said to me in the past that he is so comfortable with his child to play football because of the benefits that he gets out of it. That child's had a concussion and has sat off the field. Is concussion a risk we can manage at this stage?
Yes, I believe so. I would say I've talked about some of the statistics from the early 2000s. If you go back before, in the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, you look at some of the videos from back then, it was pretty brutal stuff in some of the contact and collision sports. And it wasn't even talked about really. Even when, I played, certainly nothing elite, I played rugby in junior days. I was probably concussed about 3 times, and on not one of those occasions did I leave the field, not because someone was being reckless or crazy, but it just wasn't the done thing back then. People rub a sponge over your face and you kept playing. And we certainly wouldn't tolerate that now. And I don't think a concussion is a reason for someone to stop playing altogether. If they've had a fairly, minor concussion, they make a full recovery and they take their time and don't go back to sport prematurely, then I would say it is okay to go back to sport. And in fact, in many conferences when I've been presenting on this, there might be 400 people in the room. If it's in Australia, I'll say, put your hand up if at any stage in your life you've played a contact or collision sport, say for 10 or more years. And, we're talking not just the football codes, but basketball, netball, etc. And in Australia, about 3/4 of the room will put their hand up when you ask that question. And then I'll say, please keep your hand up if you were never concussed. If someone's played for 5 or 10 years, only a few hands will stay up saying that they were never concussed, meaning that if you play a contact or collision sport for 5 or 10 years, you're probably likely to have one concussion along the way somewhere, 1 or 2. But the vast majority of those people go on and lead fulfilling lives and have, families and careers and all that sort of thing. And that's not to diminish people who struggle with their brain health later in life. I think we have to keep things in perspective, because there is a real danger if we cause alarm to a degree which is not based on the evidence, not based on the science, that we could, have a whole bunch of people electing or parents electing to not let their children play contact or collision sports. And I honestly believe the net result of that could be worse overall brain health for the community, because one of the greatest protectors against poor brain health is regular physical activity. And that regimen of being part of a team, you've both been parts of teams, being a team where you have to turn up for training, there's people depending on you to be at training. There's some great benefits in that. It's not just actually the physical training, it's being part of the team, the incidental social interaction that happens when you're at training and when you're competing and when you're on tour and all those sorts of things. All of those things provide benefits for brain health. So it might seem obvious that if we just got everyone to stop playing contact and collision sports, the whole world would be better off, but it's not nearly that simple. We certainly would not want to see that. But parents, sports administrators, coaches, teachers, athletes, they all want to feel, if they're going to play a contact or collision sport, that there are some parameters which ensure that the environment is as safe as possible. And if they're unfortunate enough to suffer a concussion, that they will be managed appropriately and not return to sport until it's appropriate for them to go back to sport, having fulfilled those criteria that we talk about in our return to sport guidelines. So I think we're fortunate these days that there's a lot more information available. The AIS makes all this information available for free to anybody in the world who wants to read it. It's all on the website. Our aim is to make sure that the information is in the hands of everybody who wants the information, and it's not dependent on playing elite sport or being in a cashed-up code. That if you play for under 10 water polo team in Mount Isa, you can still access that information, and that's what we're trying to do.
Well, David, you have almost convinced me that I can allow my children to play contact sport. I'm almost there. I think it's wonderful, the approach that the AIS has taken, and I think that consistent education piece is something that, as a parent, is allaying my anxiety around that. So thank you for all of the work that you're doing in this space. We have so appreciated your time today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here and lovely to speak with you both.
Okay, you were anxious leading into that conversation. How do you feel now?
Less anxious, mildly so. No, I thought it was really powerful. And I think the thing that really landed for me was when he was talking about the likelihood of having a concussion, particularly in those contact sports. Probably most people will have a concussion of some description, and how many of them then go on to live long, healthy, well lives, including their brain health. And that did make me reflect. I have had a concussion. I did not do any contact sports. I can't say that I did.
Did you run into the end of the pool?
I did not. I got hit in the head with a golf club. So a pretty significant head injury where, I was knocked unconscious, definitely suffered concussion. I ended up having a break in the nose, which was only diagnosed later. And I know that I've gone on to live a mostly put together. My brain's, pretty well intact. And that did make me realize that actually taking kids completely out of these sports that we know also have incredible team building experiences, just there's so much value in playing sport that it's worth continuing, and at the same time making sure that we are coming up to par with how we prevent, how we treat, how we navigate, and creating that succinct way for parents to know what the process is to deal with these head injuries.
We also have a resources page on our website, and we will absolutely be updating that page with a link to all the concussion materials that the AIS create. These are well-researched, collaborative guidelines that have been produced, that have been endorsed by 30 different sports, as well as all the medical people who need to be consulted. We cannot stress enough how important it is for you to sit your child out if they have experienced a concussion. It is just not on.
It's just not worth it.
And it's not worth it to be putting kids back on the field if they have had a concussion. There are guidelines in place.
Or you're just worried when David said, when in doubt, sit them out.
Yeah.
So even if it's not an obvious thing, just if there's an inkling in your stomach, just sit them out.
The Olympian says it's not going to make a difference as to whether or not you will be an elite athlete or not. Not that that's the objective of everyone, but we know it's the objective of some. Sit them out. Managers continue to report those concussions. Find the resources, inform yourself and make good decisions that are informed by proper medical advice.
We just love having these conversations. If you guys think of anything that you would love us to cover, we absolutely adore having these conversations with experts. It's something that we're really, really passionate about and we enjoy doing.
Yeah, we do. We will be back in your ears next week. In the meantime, as always, please follow us on Instagram @beingsportish. If you're in your podcast app, we would love you to hit follow. That just helps the algorithm surface us in other directions. Of course,
helps the algorithm.
Yeah, and 5-star reviews are always welcome.
I mean, not 4, only 5.
She's a gold medalist. She has expectations. We'll be back in your ears next week.
Bye.
Bye.